2015 has not been a good year for Eddie Hearn. By the end of 2014, he looked like the main man in British boxing. He was getting a lot of stick for the Bellew Cleverly pay-per-view, some of it warranted, but Groves at Wembley, massive pay-per-view, Kell Brook as a new champion, he was riding very, very high indeed. 2015, it hasn't been a bed of roses. Let's first talk about some of the problems or inactivity facing his big name fighters. We've had Carl Froch inactive, injured, not able to get the fights he's craved. We've had Kell Brook inactive, injured, missing the opportunity to be involved against a big name because he's having to fight a mandatory. We've had guys like Tony Bellew, who perhaps should have been riding the quest of a pay-per-view wave, but are instead inactive due to other commitments. Guys like Anthony Crolla headlining shows, who've had to pull out due to injury. Guys like Anthony Joshua headlining shows, who've had to pull out due to injury. Now, in addition to problems with Eddie Hearn's stable, he's also had issues making the big fights. Frampton Quigg, Carn Brook, Degale Groves. The list goes on. But these pay-per-view fights that Eddie Hearn obviously bases his business model on, for whatever reason, haven't come into fruition. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that the Matchroom shows of late have been somewhat underwhelming. There hasn't been too much hype around any of the recent activity on Sky, to be honest. Perhaps with a possible exception of Paul Smith, who, unfortunately, despite being in interesting fights, was unsuccessful. It's not been the golden period for Eddie Hearn. As I say, problems with fighters, injuries in inactivity, problems with the quality of existing shows, and problems making the big fights. However, it's just got slightly worse for Eddie Hearn. I think that he was planning a massive show on April the 25th. I have a sneaking suspicion he was maybe planning a pay-per-view night. I believe the card would have been headlined by James Degale against Andre Dirrell. I think on the undercard you'd have had Kevin Mitchell versus Linares. I think you'd have had Lee Selby versus Gradovitz. In other words, what I'm getting at is you would have had 3 Eddie Hearn fighters without belts. Selby, Degale and Mitchell fighting all in London for championship belts within their respective divisions. On the undercard, you'd have also had Anthony Joshua, Kevin Johnson. My guess is with a card potentially that strong, Eddie Hearn would have got a pay-per-view. I also think he was probably planning a pay-per-view for a proposed Froch-Chavez fight in March that got cancelled. Now, what's happened is Eddie Hearn's lost a purse bid to Warriors Boxing. Effectively, he's lost a purse bid to Al Haymon. And James Degale will not get home advantage for his fight. That also means that Selby Gradovitz, Mitchell Linares, it's questionable when these fights will go ahead, what locations they'll, what venues they'll happen at, because these fights aren't possibly big enough on their own to headline the O2. Certainly not big enough to be a pay-per-view event. So, in my opinion, it's put those matchups somewhat in jeopardy as well, at least for the time being. But the biggest issue with this James Degale thing is not actually James Degale's going to need to fight away from home. The biggest issue is that Al Haymon now has to sell the rights to a broadcasting partner of choice. And recently, as people may be aware, Al Haymon fights have actually been shown on Box Nation. How will Eddie Hearn feel if instead of James Degale fighting on a Sky pay-per-view and making Eddie Hearn a very, very substantial amount of money, how will Eddie Hearn feel if instead of that James Degale is fighting on Box Nation, which may potentially lead to a huge surge in Box Nation subscriptions, and instead of lining Eddie Hearn's pockets, will be lining Frank Warren's? I think that's a very realistic outcome. I think Frank Warren and Box Nation will do everything in their power to secure the rights to this fight. And I think with Al Heyman previously having sold the rights to his fights to PBC, to Box Nation, this is a very distinct possibility. We shall see. It's not been a wet barrel of laughs for Eddie Hearn. We'll have to see if his luck continues or if times will change for him. Let me know your thoughts. Thanks for watching.